A group of children, 4 to 8 years old, were asked the question, "What does love mean?" Here are some of their insightful and candid answers. Johnny, age 4, says, "Love is when a person loves you, they say your name different. You just know your name is safe in their mouth." Sue, age 6, says, "If you want to learn how to love better, you should start with someone you hate." Sandy, age 8, said this: "When my grandma got arthritis, she couldn't bend over to paint her toenails anymore. So my granddad does it for her, even after he got arthritis too. That's love." Andy shared these words. He says, "Love is what is in the room on Christmas if you stop opening your presents and listen." Jake, age 6, says, "Love is when a little old man and a little old woman are still friends, even after they know each other so well." 4-year-old Chloe reported, "Love is what makes you smile when you're tired." Annie, age 5, told listeners, "Love is when mommy gives daddy the best piece of chicken." Vanessa, age 8, said, "You really shouldn't tell someone that you love them unless you mean it. But if you do mean it, you should tell them a lot. People forget." Finally, Andrea, age 7, came up with this. He says, "You know you love someone because your eyelashes go up and down and little stars come out of them." We smile at the openness of children to discuss some things that they're just learning about. Our topic in this lesson is love, and we want to go to see what Paul says about it in the book of 1 Corinthians. Paul's discussion of love in 1 Corinthians 13 is sandwiched in a larger discussion of spiritual gifts in chapters 12 through 14. Of course, in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul is dealing with a church that's very divided in a myriad of ways. It's got its share of troubles. And one of those troubles was they were fighting and dividing over the spiritual gifts that God had blessed them with. In chapters 12 through 14 is an entire discussion about that. But as I said, chapter 13 is sandwiched right in the middle. And I think it's important to understand what he writes in chapter 13 in view of that larger context of chapters 12 through 14, dealing with the problem there in spiritual gifts. If you know the book of 1 Corinthians, you'll find that the end of chapter 12 and really the first verse of chapter 14 kind of form bookends for that amazing discussion of love that Paul shares there in chapter 13. We're going to get to it all, but let's work our way starting in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 31. At the end of that chapter, Paul says this, 1 Corinthians 12:31, "But earnestly desire the greater gifts, and I show you a still more excellent way." So that verse leads into chapter 13, which is indeed that more excellent way. As important as spiritual gifts are in the body of Christ, and they are vitally important, they came from God for the purpose he gave them. So they're vitally important, but Paul says here there is a better way, a way that can't devolve, if you will, into division and strife as it happened in Corinth. That's one of the dangers that come with spiritual gifts. But love is a more excellent way. That's what he's leading into here. As Paul says here, and we'll continue on in our study, Paul says that biblical love is more than emotions and feelings, although those things are part of it. True biblical love isn't devoid of emotion and feeling. It's part of that package, but the type of love Paul is going to go on to deal with here is much more than that. In fact, we could say it's very practical. In fact, that's the heading I gave here to chapter 12, verse 31, the practicality of love. It's a very practical thing, biblically speaking. The type of love we're dealing with here, that Paul's dealing with, is more than mere feeling and emotion. It's a way of living. And as he says here at the end of verse 31, it's a more excellent way. So that's the practical nature of this discussion. It's very practical. biblical love is a matter that should be of concern to all of us who claim to follow Christ. Now, as Paul moves into chapter 13, he begins with the priority of love, moving from the practicality of it to the priority of love. And that's chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. Let's read those verses. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 through 3. Paul says, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing." So you catch what Paul is speaking of here in connection with this idea of the priority of love? In comparison with the spiritual gifts that the Corinthian Christians were arguing about and fussing about, love was more important. In fact, according to Paul, one could be gifted in the extreme and yet still be nothing. Did you catch that? One could be gifted in the extreme and yet still be nothing. To put it in math terms, spiritual gifts minus love equals zero. Let's look at it from perhaps a little more modern way of speaking. If I was a silver-tongued orator and had crowds hanging on my every word and yet failed to love, it's just so much raucous noise, according to the apostle. It's no better than dragging, if you will, fingernails across a chalkboard. I like the way Eugene Peterson says in his paraphrase called The Message, this part of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Peterson paraphrases this way: "I am nothing but the creaking of a rusty gate." That's pretty vivid, isn't it? If I was really a know-it-all and yet failed to love, it's no better than an encyclopedia collecting dust on a shelf. It's useless. Paul said it, if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, I'm nothing. If I had the faith to remove mountains and yet failed to love, it amounts to nothing more than moving some rocks and dirt. I could be generous to a fault and die a martyr's death, according to Paul, but without love, there is no benefit. All these great things, but yet without love, Paul says, I'm a nothing. Peterson again summarizes this section in his paraphrase by saying, "So no matter what I say, what I believe, and what I do, I'm bankrupt without love." That's the priority of this topic for the Apostle Paul, the priority of love. Without it, nothing we do or say is really of any worth. That's the priority of love. Nothing can take precedence over it, and everything else is useless without it. That's important. Now, Paul goes on to describe the kind of love he is targeting. We've seen it's a very practical thing and that it needs to be our priority, but what does Paul mean when he talks about love? The kind of love Paul has in mind here is not some nebulous, ethereal concept that defies definition. It's not something, if you will, left open to personal interpretations or preferences. In reality, biblically speaking, it doesn't matter what you or I think it ought to be. I don't get to make my own definitions of biblical love, and neither do you. Paul, in fact, is crystal clear in his description. Let's read on in verses 4 through the first part of verse 8. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8a. Notice this picture of love. It's a very vivid description. Paul says, love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. This kind of love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love, the first part of verse 8 says, love never fails. As I read through these verses, and perhaps as you reflect on them as well, I'm struck by just how countercultural biblical love truly is when you think about it. Think about what we see and experience in the world around us by the things that people label as love. Compared to what we see and experience in the world around us, this kind of love truly is revolutionary, isn't it? Think about how often you see love masqueraded as just the opposite of what we see here. Instead of love being patient, we too often see it being impatient. Instead of love being kind, we see it people being unkind, and yet somehow claiming it's loving someone else. It is envious. It does like to brag and is sometimes arrogant. Worldly love, in many cases, acts unbecomingly. It does seek its own and is easily provoked. It's always counting wrongs, keeps track of those kind of things. Worldly love often rejoices in unrighteousness and doesn't care much about the truth. It refuses to bear all things and believe all things and hope all things and endure all things. And far too often we notice worldly love is failing. It's just a masquerade in many cases. See, there's no doubt as to the kind of love called from a follower of Christ, according to Paul. It is countercultural. It can be difficult. Yet this is it. Paul doesn't beat around the bush at all. Paul transitions now from picturing love. Now we've seen what it looks like. Paul transitions from picturing or describing that love to highlighting its enduring character. We got a hint of that in the first part of verse 8 when it says love never fails, but let's read on in verse 8 through verse 12. I've titled this part of chapter 12 or 13 as the permanence of love. The permanence of love. Love, as we often see and experience in the world around us, can also be fleeting. You've perhaps experienced or you know of situations where promises of enduring love in a marriage are often quickly discarded in favor of a new love. The words "I love you" are too often contingent on the ever-shifting sands of bank accounts, emotions, job situation, or a myriad of other issues. In reality, a lot of worldly love is not permanent at all. Just kind of arrangement based until circumstances change. In contrast, though, biblical love will be there when all else goes away or changes. Here's how Paul says it, starting again in verse 8. He says, love never fails, but, so he's contrasting again the situation with the gifts in Corinth to this excellent way, this more excellent way. It says, love never fails, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. I know in part, but then I will be fully known. I will know fully, rather, just as I have been fully known. So the Corinthian believers here in context were focusing on what? Transitory issues and missing the truly stable one. They were so laser focused on their battles over spiritual gifts that they were missing the truly foundational thing. Paul describes it this way in these verses. And in focusing on things like prophecy and knowledge and all the things, tongues, as he talks about, in essence, they were trading the partial for the complete. Again, you would know in part, prophesy in part, but when the perfect, and that word perhaps in this context would be, if it's being contrasted with partial, would be better translated complete. That's the idea of perfect, the biblical word for perfect. They were trading the partial for the complete. But not only that, these brethren were trading childishness for maturity. He highlights it that way. He says, when I was a child, I used to do childish things. And the Corinthians were acting childishly in connection with the gifts. He says, when I became a man, I did away with childish things. So the Corinthians were trading childishness for maturity, but they were also, as we see right at the end, they were trading a dim reflection for reality. Yeah, this idea of looking in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. I know in part, then I will be fully known. So they were getting it backwards, again, focusing on the changing things for the truly stable one. In reality, isn't it easy to get distracted like that in our Christian life? We get focused on so many different things, and sometimes love gets pushed to the periphery, and that's when trouble comes. Just like Esau in the Old Testament, we end up trading our birthright for a bowl of stew and live to regret it. That happens every time we start focusing on the partial, the childish, the dim reflections rather than looking in a loving way for what's complete and mature and real. Well, Paul ends chapter 13 here with a summary statement emphasizing the prominence of love. The prominence of love. That's verse 13, right at the end of the chapter. Paul says, but now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So here Paul transitions beyond the immediate discussion of spiritual gifts. Remember, it's right in the middle of this whole discussion in 3 chapters. Paul goes beyond the immediate discussion of that problem to a consideration of the 3 great primary Christian attributes: faith, hope, and love. All good things, all biblical concepts. This holy triumvirate, faith, hope, and love, crops up in other places in Paul's writings. Perhaps you're thinking of 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. 1 Thessalonians 1, 2 through 4, Paul says, we give thanks to God always for all of you, making mention of you in our prayers, constantly bearing in mind your work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ, in the presence of our God and Father, knowing, brethren, beloved by God, his choice of you. So he's praising the Thessalonian church for having these 3 Christian attributes. Then later in 1 Thessalonians, this time the last chapter, chapter 5, verses 4 through 8, it comes up again. 1 Thessalonians 5, 4 through 8, he says, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night, nor of darkness. So then, let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. For those who sleep do their sleeping at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation. So you have it again, faith, hope, and love. All things Paul encouraged in those that he taught. But even in this august company, if you will, what reigns supreme, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 13? It's love that reigns supreme. All else, even though important, takes second place. Finally, after discussing the priority, the picture, the permanence, and the prominence of love, Paul ends by encouraging his readers in the pursuit of love. And that's the first verse of chapter 14. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 1, the pursuit of love. Notice what he says. Pursue love, yet desire earnestly spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. Now remember, it's very similar to what Paul said at the end of chapter 12. Remember what he said there? 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 31, he says, but earnestly desire the greater gifts, but I show you a still more excellent way. So he's not dissing spiritual gifts, earnestly desire it, but don't forget love takes precedence. Now he gets to chapter 14, verse 1, and says, pursue love, yet earnestly desire spiritual gifts that you may prophesy. So once again, nothing wrong with gifts if they're kept in their place, and that's subservient to love. You see, practicing biblical love is not something into which you will stumble. That's why we're talking about here the pursuit of love. You just don't fall, as we talk about falling in love. Well, biblical love is not something you stumble into. It's so different from what the world often promotes as love that it will take sustained effort and determination to practice. This kind of love, as was described in chapter 14, is something that takes work and effort and determination. It's not going to fall into our laps. As Paul says here, we have to pursue it. Now, biblical love isn't elusive, or it is elusive rather, in comparison to the world around us. Biblical love is elusive, not because God wants it to be difficult, but because we are often too busy pursuing other things. That's why sometimes love has to be pursued, because we're too busy chasing after everything else. First Peter chapter 4 and verse 3 reminds us of some of those other pursuits. First Peter 4 verse 3 says, "For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries." Those are all some pretty ugly sins. And Paul is writing to those believers and says, you know what? You need to leave those things alone, because that was part of your previous life, pre-Christian life. Of course you pursued those things then. So those are some of the pursuits that occupy our time rather than pursuing love. But you see, it doesn't always have to be sinful things that divert our pursuit of love. It can be good things that just need to be kept in perspective, like spiritual gifts. Again, nothing wrong with spiritual gifts. Paul says twice at the end of chapter 12 and the first part here of chapter 14, he encourages those brethren to pursue spiritual gifts, but not at the exclusion of pursuing love. That's our ultimate pursuit. Let's draw our lesson to a close by just highlighting how often the rest of the New Testament highlights the priority of love. Again, it's what we ought to pursue because it's the primary thing. Jesus himself said it in unmistakable terms in places like Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 through 40. Matthew 22 rather, 35 through 40. A lawyer comes up to Jesus and asks him a question, testing him. Verse 36, he says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" So this is Jesus's opportunity to get right down to the nitty gritty and says, here's the core of the matter. What's Jesus going to say? And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and prophets." You get the power of what Jesus is saying there? When asked what's the greatest commandment, Jesus in essence says it's love, loving God, loving your neighbor. The rest of the commandments depend or hang, if you will, on that principle. Jesus is saying the same thing Paul is saying. Paul emphasized it over and over again in his writings. In Romans 13, verse 8, he says, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law." So owe nothing but love to each other. Later in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 14, he says, "Let all that you do be done in love." Colossians 3 verse 14, "Beyond all these things put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity." 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 5, Paul says, "But the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith." Paul says the goal of what I'm trying to teach is love. He's re-emphasizing what he's just taught in 1 Corinthians. Peter agrees in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8. He says, "Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins." Peter has the same priority that Paul does. He says, above all, keep fervent for your love. Not that other things are not necessarily unimportant, but above all, keep fervent in your love. Love truly is the pinnacle. Love truly is the glue, if you will, that makes the Christian system work. And as Paul has encouraged us here in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It truly is all about love. I remember at one point in a discussion group that someone was criticizing another person for talking so much about love, and something was said in the context of love, love, love. That's all you ever hear. Well, I suppose it's possible to overdo love in the Christian system, but when I think about it carefully, I'm not sure there is. From what we've seen from Paul and from Peter and Jesus, I'm not sure you can overdo biblical love. Maybe it ought to be what we hear from believers, something for you and I to think about as we seek to serve God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. Let's love God. Let's love our neighbor and fulfill God's wishes for our life. Let everything be done in love. God bless. And we look forward to seeing you again.